Hey everyone, welcome back to VBU. As you likely have noticed, the subject of justice, of wrongs needing to be righted, is very prevalent in our time and culture. In some ways, it almost seems like we're at a kind of tipping point regarding tension about this. I wonder though, how many people have ever stopped to ask themselves, why am I so angry about injustice? And what I mean by that is, can people describe a reasonable foundation for it more than just, well, I just feel this way? Do they understand a foundation for why they feel a certain way? Now, as a recap, in previous segments on a defense of the Christian faith and under the heading, Is There a God?, we've used inference to the best explanation, asking some questions and then inferring a response. So why is there matter instead of no matter? And I've inferred there is an eternal cause. Why is there life instead of no life? I've inferred that the eternal cause is intelligent. Why is there consciousness instead of no consciousness? And I've inferred that the eternal cause is a conscious living being. And now today we ask the question, why do we get angry at injustice? Or another way of putting it is, why do we assume moral realism? And what I'm going to work on inferring now is that the eternal cause is a being that is the essence of absolute moral goodness. Now we're going to look at 8 points and they're going to build on each other. So the first point I want to look at, I want to make this assertion that there is pervasive evidence for objective moral realism. Now, keep in mind the word objective simply means something is true or real, whether anyone believes it or accepts it or not. Think of a statement like this when it comes to objective morality. The statement is, torturing children for fun is wrong. So this is a statement of objective moral realism. Neil Shenvi is a graduate of both Princeton and Cal Berkeley, and so he's been exposed to all kinds of alternative views about this. But he writes in his book, Why Believe, he says, objective moral facts are analogous to physical facts in that they are true or false independent of our beliefs. He says a moral statement like torturing children for pleasure is evil is objectively true if its truth does not depend on whether people accept it. He says the position that moral facts exist is known as moral realism. So, evidence for this includes, letter A, various virtues have been accepted across ages and civilizations. The very famous Christian C.S. Lewis, the Oxford Don, in his book Abolition of Man, to summarize it, he explains that while applications and expressions of moral principles might differ from culture to culture, he says there's much evidence that there are basic moral principles that cut across cultural lines. And this is true even in light of apparent moral conflict. He says it would be faulty to conclude that morality is relative. And then also, letter B, in the very least, cultures universally affirm that categories of right and wrong exist. Shenvi puts it this way. He says moral relativists who claim to have seen through the illusion of objective morality, he says they continue to behave as if objective morality exists. In fact, Shenvi writes, since this is true, and since many even agree on many basic moral issues, it's difficult to argue that moral disagreement constitutes evidence against the existence of objective moral values and duties of any kind. In other words, we shouldn't just deny morality exists just because we have trouble knowing the answers for some different situations. That's Geisler and Turek. So, like with disagreement over physical facts, The presence of disagreement does not entail that these questions have no objectively correct answer. Just because people differ of how to measure or quantify gravity doesn't mean gravity doesn't exist or that there is evidence for no gravity. In fact, it's actually just the opposite in the same way with moral truths and objective morality. So, number one, there's pervasive evidence for objective moral realism. Also, number two, denial of objective moral realism becomes self-refuting. Now, keep in mind relativism applied to morality is the idea that right and wrong is deemed to be relative to the culture or to the individual. The philosopher Paul Copan puts it this way. He says, even relativists who claim that someone's values may be true for one person but not for others are likely to be the same people who say, I have rights, or you ought to be tolerant. Once again, no matter how much people claim to hold to a position of relative morality, most people will continue to behave as if objective morality exists. In fact, Geisler and Turek use the illustration of a professor and a student. Think of it this way. A professor has a student and gives them an assignment to write a position paper. He gives them all the directions, all the ways he needs to research in support of his position. And so the student writes a paper. The paper is on the subject that there is no moral realism. There's no real objective right and wrong. Every view is just opinion. It's like your preference for ice cream flavors or favorite colors. So the professor gets the paper, he grades it, he hands it back to the student, and he gives him a big F, fail. The student says, why? I met all the qualifications. The professor says, well, the folder you put it in is blue, and I don't like blue. So of course the student takes exception to it and says, oh, that's wrong, that's unfair, that's unjust, I'm being unjustly treated. And yet the professor stares down the student and says, I'm only acting according to the thesis position that you have presented. This scenario fits right into what C.S. Lewis describes famously in his book, Mere Christianity. He says, whenever you find a man who says he does not believe in a real right and wrong, he says, you're going to find the same man going back on this a moment later. He says he may break his promise to you, but if you try breaking one to him, he's going to likely be complaining, it's not fair, before you can say Jack Robinson. So the presence of disagreement bears evidence there are moral, objective obligations, often in the very instance that people are disagreeing. It's like what we've looked at previously on the subject of relative truth. Somebody says there is no absolute truth. Wait a minute, is it absolutely true that there's no absolute truth? It's a self-refuting statement. It explodes on itself. In this case with morality, it's like saying we ought not hold to ought nots, or we shouldn't speak of shouldn'ts. Ted Turner, who was a very outspoken atheist and the cable TV mogul and multimillionaire, his views have changed somewhat these days, but back in his days as an outspoken atheist and then agnostic, he used to say, people of this age shouldn't be told to do anything. But you notice that Ted Turner was telling people not to tell people what to do. Now, again, Turner's views have changed, maybe partly realizing his incongruency with his positions. So, recap. Number one, objective moral realism is pervasive. Number two, denial of objective moral realism becomes self-refuting. Number three, without objective moral realism, there is no place for reform. When somebody's angry about injustice, what are they talking about? We need reform. Reform assumes objective moral realism. We're going to look at a couple different kinds of reform and consider objective moral realism related to them. One is cultural, societal reform. The other is personal reform. So let's call this letter A, cultural and societal reform. In this area of reform, cultural relativism says morality is defined simply by the deep historical roots of that culture. So somebody says, well, it's just up to the culture and the society. Really? Does the same person accept someone saying, let's say something as heinous as racism? Oh, well, yeah, that's right. Racism is not wrong for us in our culture because it's deeply ingrained in our culture. No, people probably would not accept that. Maybe some would. The famous Christian missionary Amy Carmichael in India, many know, was rescuing young ladies out of sex trafficking because they were being pulled into prostitution for the cultural, religious Hindu temples in their place and time. According to cultural relativism, well, they could have just said, and some of them did, well, this kind of sex trafficking is not wrong for us because it's deeply ingrained in our culture. So not only is there really no place for cultural and societal reform without objective moral realism, there's also, letter B, no place for personal reform. This is sometimes called personal reform in ethical subjectivism. And trying to mash those, you can't do it. Ethical subjectivism says morality is defined by the individual. It's the idea of what's wrong for you may not be right for me. And yet, would the same person accept someone saying, racism might be wrong for you, but it's not wrong for me? How about sex trafficking might be wrong for you, but it's not for me? If you're watching this and you strongly feel racism and sex trafficking are wrong for everyone, you're not really a cultural relativist or an ethical subjectivist. You are taking the position of a moral realist. Now, going beyond that into number 4, without objective moral realism, the innate value of humans cannot be supported. Now, by supported, I mean that it cannot have a rational foundation. People sometimes confuse this with the assertion that no one who identifies as a materialist or an atheist can be moral. That's not the statement. That's not the position. The question is, can innate human value be foundationally supported? Or is it logically consistent with staunch materialism? Here in the United States, we have in our founding documents of our nation at least a basic understanding of this principle. The Declaration of Independence says that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. As Geisler and Turek point out the implications of this, in a non-theistic worldview, we have a very difficult time supporting the concept of rights. Our nation is founded on that principle. In the 1800s, there is a German atheist philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, who actually agrees with this. Now, as a Christian theist, I would disagree that there is no God, but the no God movement leader, Friedrich Nietzsche, concludes that the same implications are true of what we're talking about in a no God, a non-theistic worldview. In fact, in his book, Beyond Good and Evil, he blames equality on a Christian worldview. He says if we could just get rid of this Christianity, which is not sufficiently noble to see the radically different grades of rank and intervals that separate man from man with their so-called equality for God. He says this is what's responsible for creating these dwarf, ludicrous, bad stock humans. And the question we ask is Nietzsche being logically inconsistent? Well, we would disagree with Nietzsche's atheism, but we would agree with his logical consistency. In fact, there's another guy that agreed with it as well. And he was a big fan of Nietzsche. His name is Adolf Hitler. And in my own copy of Mein Kampf, I own this book, as a matter of fact, Hitler made this statement: if nature throughout hundreds and thousands of years establishes an evolutionary higher state of being, he says such preservation goes hand in hand with the inexorable law that it is the strongest and the best who must triumph, and that they have the right to endure. Notice, based on Nietzsche's anti-God worldview, how do we get rights? He says the rights are given to the strong and the best for human flourishing. They're the ones that have rights. And he says also in this worldview, he who does not wish to be strong and fight in this world where struggle is the law of life, he says he does not have the right to exist. And hence we have eugenics, hence we have Nazi Germany eliminating the bad stock. Why? Because humans don't have intrinsic worth according to that materialist worldview. Okay, number 5, going from that, stemming exactly from that, unguided evolutionary naturalism cannot account for objective morality. Even if unguided objective materialism is true, time plus matter plus chance and multi variations of unguided mutations is how we ended up with humans, even if that's how we got to the way we could be, that does only explains what is. It doesn't explain what should be. Listen to what Neil Shenvi says. Real moral duties describe what we ought to do, not what we are actually doing. Darwin's writings, specifically Descent of Man, gives examples of how right and wrong could have just been deemed very different relative to how we happened to evolve. Which is why Shenvi says this. He says, neither moral facts or duties seem to be reducible to physical facts. Shenvi suggests noting the difference between two statements. Think of it this way. He says, here's one statement. The Earth orbits the sun, but it ought to orbit Saturn. Well, compare that to, I stole this bag of Doritos, but I ought to have paid for it. This is why the theist philosopher holds, if a God, or you could say a transcendent lawgiver, does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. Again, who agrees with that? Both atheists and theists. Atheist German philosophers, we said Nietzsche, he totally agrees with it. Read his madman ideas. And then theist Russian philosopher Dostoevsky also agrees with this. Read Brothers Karamazov. Also, atheist evolutionary scientist Michael Roos in more modern times has made this statement. He says, morality is a biological adaptation no less than our hands and feet and teeth. He says, considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. He says, I appreciate that when someone says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they're referring above and beyond themselves. He says, nevertheless, such references are truly without foundation. Again, this is an atheist speaking, not a Christian. He says, morality is just an error to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. No wonder Christian thinker Paul Copan says, if human beings are simply the product of naturalistic evolution, then we have no foundation for moral obligation and human dignity. Now, how has this played out? Not everybody has played it out logically this way, but many have. In fact, Peter Singer is a bioethicist at Princeton. Peter Singer holds that a 21-day-old baby has no more intrinsic worth than a chicken. Also, atheists Randy Thornhill and Craig Palmer have stated, evolutionary atheists say that rape, I'm talking about rape, is a natural biological phenomenon that is a product of the human evolutionary heritage, just like the leopard's spots and the giraffe's elongated neck. Take it to another extreme. Infamous serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer explained himself this way. He said, "If it all happens naturalistically, can't I set my own rules? Who owns me? I own myself." Now, let's backpedal again before everybody runs away offended. The assertion here is not that being an atheist makes you a serial killer. The position is that there is no objective foundation to not be. Or to say something like why Mother Teresa was better than Adolf Hitler. Why do we hold that Mother Teresa was better than Adolf Hitler? Shenvi says physical facts simply describe the universe as is, but moral duties prescribe the way humans ought to behave. And then ask the question, so where do these moral facts and duties come from? Now, there's still pushback. No, we don't need a God. So number 6, we just have atheistic moral realism. Now, some have attempted to argue for this, what's termed atheistic moral realism. Their notion is that moral values and duties do exist in reality, and they're not dependent on evolution or human opinion, and they insist that they're also not grounded in God. They just exist. Now, along these lines, various attempts have been made to build meta-ethical foundations without the aid of ultimate meaning or a giver, a God of ultimate meaning. An example is John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism in the 1800s. This is a form of Epicureanism, which is known as the greatest happiness principle. In other words, morality is just built on good, meaning the enhancement of pleasure, and evil, meaning the diminishing of pain. And so, as Mill's argument plays itself out, what you end up with is, in order to be able to maintain a moral code distinct from just supporting just this big ongoing frat party, Mill saw to it the need to apply a test of quality regarding those things that prompt pleasure. So you end up with these quality control judges, and they just end up being people of Mill's own knowledge and expertise. So what you simply have is the movement from an intrinsic need for a lawgiver God to a lawgiver of another variety, namely Mill's and his peers. It's like we end up with Mills, while saying we don't need God, still conceding that we still need a lawgiver. Notice how this coheres with what Richard Taylor's, the Christian thinker, conclusion is. He says a duty is something that's owed, but something can be owed only to some person or persons. There can be no such thing as a duty in isolation. But now, someone will say, if the lawgiver is God as the foundational source of morality, what about the Euthyphro dilemma? Okay, number 7, I'm going to assert this. The Euthyphro dilemma is a false dilemma. Now, what is this? This dates back to the writings of Plato, where Socrates asked the character Euthyphro, do the gods will something because it's good, or is something good because God wills it? Which seems to make good and evil just simply arbitrary. William Lane Craig has written extensively on this subject, and he says it's simply a false dilemma. He says it's not the case God wills something because it is good, nor is it the case something is good just because God wills it. He says God wills something because he is good. Because God is good, his commandments to us reflect necessarily his nature. It's the same kind of category error that people make when they say, well, who created God? It's like asking who created the uncreated non-contingency. Neil Shenvi puts it this way: moral goodness is grounded in God's nature, and moral obligations are constituted by God's commands. Because God's moral goodness is essential to his nature, asking whether God is necessarily good is like asking whether the circle is necessarily round. It's like asking whether God is necessarily eternal. No, that's what we mean by God. Do we ask the question, is the bachelor necessarily single? That's what we mean by the category. Okay, number 8, finally. The inference that we're making here is the best explanation for objective moral laws and prescriptions is a transcendent moral lawgiver and prescriber. Geisler and Turek have put this very succinctly, simply that objective moral laws require an objective moral lawgiver. Peter Kreeft summarizes Thomas Aquinas' thoughts on this and what Aquinas calls his ways of understanding God. This is just the basics of natural theology. In the same way that there must be a first cause for the existence of all things, Aquinas says there must also be a first cause of perfection or goodness or value. He says we rank things as more or less perfect or good or valuable, and unless this ranking is false or meaningless, there must be a real standard of perfection to make such a hierarchy possible. For a thing is ranked higher on the hierarchy of perfection only insofar as it's closer to the standard, the ideal, the most perfect. Unless there is a most perfect being, to be that real standard of perfection, all our value judgments are meaningless and impossible. He says such a most perfect being or real ideal standard of perfection is another description of God. Even atheist philosopher J.L. Mackie agrees with Aquinas on this, as this is a foundation for the existence of God. Now, he doesn't agree that there is objective moral realism, but if there is, he says it's a foundation for the existence of God. He says that if there are objective values, they make the existence of a God more probable than it would have been without them. He says, thus we have a defensible argument from morality to the existence of God. Even agnostic Paul Draper said a moral world is very probable on theism. This is why so many professing atheist materialists will balk at the idea of moral realism. Very famously, the very dogmatic, outspoken atheist Richard Dawkins holds that the observable universe reveals that there is no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. Now, having read the God Delusion and so many other of Dawkins' books, the question is, going all the way back to our original statement, then why be so angry about injustice? One of the most acerbic book, angry at injustices, is the God Delusion, and yet Dawkins admits, or at least claims to admit, that our universe doesn't reveal any foundation for this, at least from a material point of view. Strangely, Dr. Dawkins actually recently came out with a statement that he holds that cultural Christianity is preferable to other religious worldviews. I can't help but wonder if Dr. Dawkins doesn't realize what a true atheist state will become based on even historical evidence that we've seen even in the last century and a half. In fact, think about Ted Turner. And Ted Turner, once again, who back at the time was a staunch atheist materialist, holding that humans are just a composite of chemicals and physics. He was asked on a show with David Frost, do you have any regrets in your life? And he says, yes, I regret the way I treated my first wife. So we've asked the question, well, why the anger about injustice? Another question might be, why the remorse for our immoral actions if we're just the product of blind time plus matter plus chance? I remain hopeful for Mr. Turner and even for Dr. Dawkins, or for anyone watching this, to come to the realization that there is definitely more than just this staunch physicalism that people claim that they hold to. Norm Geisler, the Christian thinker, from a chapter in his book, Why I Am a Christian, breaks it down in the following way, and this is a good summary of what we've just looked at. Number one, there is an absolute moral law. Number two, all absolute moral laws must have an absolute moral lawgiver. Number three, therefore, there is an absolute moral lawgiver. Now, in support of this crucial first premise, the theist points to the following evidence. One, we cannot know injustice unless we know what justice is. Two, we cannot measure the progress or lack of it of society unless there is a standard outside of society by which we can measure it. Three, if there is no objective moral law, then no real moral disagreement can ever be possible. Four, the fact that we do know Mother Teresa was better than Adolf Hitler reveals an objective standard by which we're making the comparison. In short, if there is even one absolute moral law, we shouldn't torture children for fun. Then there must be an absolute moral lawgiver. Now, are we just talking to ourselves? Has anyone ever really been convinced of the existence of God, at least partly, because of this moral realism argument? C.S. Lewis, the Oxford Don, was an avowed atheist. And he held to his atheism partly because he thought the existence of evil proved God did not exist. But then he realized he was borrowing from the concept of God to ground his disproving of God. And in his book, Mere Christianity, he made this famous statement. He says, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust, but how had I gotten this idea of just and unjust? He says, a man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? Lewis realized the comparison was with a transcendent, conscious person, a lawgiver, meaning God. So, a summary up to this point in this series, as we've inferred, there is a transcendent, eternal cause that is intelligent, conscious, and moral. Romans chapter 1 tells us that this God has made himself known to us, although people will still suppress the truth. And we see that going on today, but it's an active suppression as opposed to really considering what we call natural theology, the revelation of God's self within us. However, even though this is what theists of various kinds call God, somebody now would say, well, there's lots of ideas about God or even gods. I mean, are we talking monotheism, polytheism? So why hold to the distinctly Christian view of God? That's what we're going to begin looking at the beginning of the next sizable subject, next time in this series, a defense of Christian belief. We'll see you here on VBU next time.